Okay, thank you everyone for coming to it today. We're joined by Esteban, who'll talk to us about modeling the co-evolution of life. He obtained his bachelor's in marine biology at the National University of Costa Rica in 2007. Then he moved to Germany for his master's studies in tropical aquatic ecology at the University of Bremen, and he later obtained a doctoral degree from Jacobs University Bremen for his work on macro-ecological properties of marine phytoplankton. He then worked as a postdoctoral researcher at the Lebanese Institute for Tropical Marine Research for 6 years, where he delved into topics related to phytoplankton, trait-based ecology, marine megafauna, coral reef ecology, human resource interactions, and environmental pollution. Since 2022, he holds a postdoctoral position at the German Research Center for Geosciences, where he is trying to unravel the links between tectonics, climate, and biodiversity as part of the German Research Foundation Collaborative Research Center, Earth Evolution at the Dry Limit. Thank you very much for coming today, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you. So thank you again for the kind invitation, Jesse and the organizers of the seminar. And for me, it's a great honor to be here and to talk to you guys. That particularly a crowd of Earth system scientists, because let's see, now it doesn't want to. There you go. Because mainly, I appreciate a lot to have this holistic view or this system view. And during the introduction, it was mentioned, so I have been working on topics related with particularly systems ecology, related with phytoplankton and in other fields. And this is the project that I'm going to present you guys is basically the one where I'm trying to link other spheres of the Earth system. So, but of course, having this Earth system perspective is nothing new. At least we can go a century back to Alfred Lotka, where he nicely put it in his book of Elements of Physical Biology, where basically he was trying to make or introduce physical or principles of physical sciences or physics into biology. And I like this part because he's trying to make the analogy with a word engine. And here I'm paraphrasing what he mentioned over there, but it's basically to have a series of subunits that interact and transform energy into different compartments and also recycle that type of energy. Modern views of this have been, for example, the one of Axel Kleidon, in his thermodynamics foundations of the Earth system, where he's also linking these different elements and using thermodynamics theory to explain these links between the different components of the Earth system. But I could have cited perhaps David Wilkinson or some others that have made the same case, and particularly with a bigger focus to Gaia. But what I like about this part, when he's trying to make this link, is to the part that he's referring to the evolution, so that all of the components of the system actually they tend to change over time, so they progress. In a way, he doesn't specify quite well. The wording that he used actually is to improve, but what he's referring to is that this system basically evolves, and the components of the system evolves. And when I'm thinking about this system of coevolution between different components, it reminds me to the work of Tim of the coevolutionary ladder, where we have components of the biotic and abiotic parts of the Earth system that they interact and basically into an intertwined history that is what we have on Earth right now. So these underlying principles is something that you will see it present here and there, and try to take them in my talk. But specifically, I'm not working for this project on the whole Earth system. I'm looking at particularly a high elevation environment, so terrestrial and high elevation environment, and the links that in these areas it has with biodiversity and with the climate. Again, we have to go a bit back in history because this is not new. At least we can go back 200 years to Alexander von Humboldt, that he inspired us until today, and not only because of his beautiful drawings and detailed remarks. As you can see, we have different zones where different plants inhabit, and depending on how high and the latitude that these high relief areas occur, we have different of these habitat zones in the tropics, in temperate regions, or even in high latitude regions. So, but the challenge, of course, have been on what is causing this. And not so long ago, Carsten Rabeck has delved into these topics, and Antonelli and Karina Horn and some others. And here in this review, they summarize this Humboldt's enigma, as Carsten put it. And what you can see here, what is fascinating about looking at this, is that if we take the Earth's landmass, mountain ranges occupy only a quarter of the landmass, but they contain 85% of the biodiversity in terms of mammal, birds, and amphibians. And particularly areas like in the northern Andes, for example, they have a very high biodiversity, or areas also in the Henbon Mountains of the Tibetan plateau, nearby the Tibetan plateau. So these are very important topics, and also they have high levels of endemism in some of these areas. Yes, I speak up loud. Yes. Okay, sorry. Yeah. Should I stay here better then?
If you just speak up, it should be.
Okay, sorry. And try to unravel the causes of these patterns of diversity. They have made compilations with other data sets, particularly related climate and geological drivers. And this was the work also Carsten Rabeck was involved, but it's Antonelli was the lead of that paper, and they saw that when they look at particular mountain ranges, they see that climate drivers, mainly precipitation and temperature, and also some ranges in temperature and seasonality, or those related with geology, and they mainly found relief and the different types of soil to be the most important drivers for the patterns of the biodiversity that we observe today. So, but still, it seems that what is described in this Humboldt's enigma, and this is how Rabeck ended up concluding the paper, is basically the environmental heterogeneity that is provided in high relief environments in the tropics, that provides different types of habitats for species to specialize and then to produce in high diversity numbers. And if we think about this in geological time scales, of course, an orogen, so a mountain range, could shift its shape and altitude, providing different set of these habitats that then are going to be colonized by different species. And as the changes in the habitat occur through deep time, so you can have a specialization, competition, and therefore to have changes in these species numbers. But yes?
I think, I'm not sure who that is, but they might just be saying that it's a bit difficult to hear. A few people are saying that.
Okay.
I can just stay near the back.
Okay, I will stay here. Yeah. I don't know. Maybe it's the microphone of it's not using the microphone of the laptop, maybe instead of this microphone.
I might be using the microphone.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, I will stay here. Sorry about that. Sorry for the technical issues. Yeah. But it has been pointed out by since
the green bag into the house. Sorry? The green bag, is it now back in the house?
Sorry?
Great, good.
Okay. So at least from 2017 and also through at least I can track back to 2020. The several groups of people have been pointing out that there is a lack of numerical tools that integrate that landscape change to the time, the climate, and also eco-evolutionary process. So there has been a need for this type of tool. There have been some that have been produced in the past 2 years or so, including the one that I'm going to present to you today, which is our approach. So how do we take this? So we basically are building up on a landscape evolution model. And how do we model a landscape? So we'll go step by step so that everybody's on the same boat with me. So it's the easiest way to think about it. How do we evolve landforms in a computer is to think about in the competition of two processes. So the uplift of bedrock and how this bedrock is being eroded. And then over time, if uplift is greater than erosion, so the mountains are going to grow. And it will reach a point where they can reach like a type of steady state where they will not change over time, where these processes are balanced out. But as soon as erosion is greater than uplift, so you start to erode the materials on the hilltops and then transport it to the lowlands and then to the sea. So in mathematical terms, how do we do that? It's fairly simple, in the simplest way that geomorphologists do this. And we have an uplift rate that could be a function, of course, of time, but also in space. We have a process that is, well, two main processes that is leading to erosion. One that is the strongest erosional process that we have in landscape, which is river incision, which is just how basically our rivers cut through bedrock, and this is how landscapes are being formed. And we have erosional processes related with hill slopes processes. And you see a lot of letters here and what they are referring. So the A is the drainage area to a power, S is the slope of the terrain, and KF is a constant of erodibility, and nu we refer to as a constant related with the climate or climate variability, but some people tend to model these two together. And this, in this KF, could be a lot of things: lithology, different types of rock, different type of processes. And with respect to the hill slope processes, is basically the curvature of the environment. So how stable is the slope of a mountain? And then what is trying to mimic here is transport processes like, for example, landslides, debris flows, or soil creep, this type of process, on a very simplified terms. So what we do in the modeling framework that we are using, that is called FastScape, that solves this equation in a two-dimensional grid very efficiently, is that on top of solving this, we include the climate. We use another module, because with FastScape, what we can do is to have different modules that build up on top of this. And for the climate, what we do, we have a linear orographic precipitation model. It's a model that was produced in the 90s by Smith. And what it basically takes is the direction of the wind, the speed of the wind, and has certain constants for the amount of moisture that is in the clouds and in the air that is being moved. And as the mountains rise up and these clouds hit certain elevation, these condense, and then you produce different rainfall patterns in a 2D grid. So we have then a way to describe the evolution of landforms and of climate. And here, just to show you with an example that I think is easier to see in an animation, you're going to see on the left column, basically what I call a dynamic environment. So it's a dynamic environment because we start with a flat landscape, and then we let this evolve over time. And I have a constant uplift rate across the whole landscape. It's 100 kilometers by 100 kilometers. And on top, you will see the rainfall field that I started also with a base level of precipitation that is uniform across the landscape. On the right-hand side, you see what I call a static environment, which is at the end of the simulation. I run for exactly the same amount of time, so 20 million years. Only that I set these two constants that I show you for the hill slope process and for the river incision to 0. So basically no erosion and no uplift. So it's just the model run. And what you can see basically is like only with this process of uplift and the orographic precipitation, you see how the mountains start to rise up, the rivers start to erode, and you tend to form a main drainage divide in the middle of the model domain. And as the mountain is rising, you see how the precipitation patterns, because the wind is coming in this direction, you create a windward side of the mountain that is wetter, and then a rain shadow effect on the other side of the mountain. So it is a drier climate conditions. So, and this is the type of simulations that we can get. Oops. And this is just to summarize this. So on the top row, you see the results for the static environment, for elevation, and for precipitation. And on the second row, you see for the dynamic landscape at selected time steps. And on the bottom, the big panels that you see there is basically the time evolution in terms of the mean elevation and the mean precipitation, the thicker lines for the static and the dynamic environment, and the maximum and minimum values for these two environmental fields over time. Just as a reminder, just see that between 1 to 3 million years is when the slope or the rate of change is the fastest, basically. So when the mountain is growing at that time, and keep just that number in mind for the results that I'm going to show you. So on top of this modeling framework of landscapes, then we put the evolution of life, and here we do as simple as possible. So we consider a given landscape, and for this landscape, we have two sets of main group of processes, those related with evolutionary processes and those related with ecological processes. And among the evolutionary processes, we have dispersal, mutation, and selection. And among the ecological processes, we have the presence or absence of competition for a single resource. And here I have the competition of a single resource. I have only like given by a carrying capacity of the system. So, and this is by no means something new. This comes from a long tradition on adaptive speciation. And there has been models of this written before, and I can just show you what are the extensions that we have done to this process that I'm including right now. So let's go step by step of this process. So the individuals in the landscape then are characterized by a trait, and this trait I related to the environmental field. I will show you how they relate it. It could be one trait, or it could be two traits, or even more than one trait. So normally these adaptive speciation models are described on a single trait. And then we compute, for the selection, we could compute the environmental fitness. And here, since I have more than one trait, I use a multivariate Gaussian distribution to describe this process. Normally you see it as a single Gaussian distribution, this process. And if you think about it, the way that I do it is, how do I relate it to the environmental field, is basically by making an assumption of the relationship between the optimal trait value to the ranges of the environmental field. So the maximum and minimum of the values that I can reach in terms of elevation or precipitation. And I assume this to be linear, and we can play around with this value to be a positive or a negative relationship. And if we run this, just to, you can see as an example, let's assume that we have an individual with a given trait value for the trait 1 and 2, and the closest they are to this optimal trait value, the higher their fitness. So the higher the number of offspring that they are going to have. The farther away they are from this, the lower the number of offspring that they are going to have. And this it depends, of course, on where the organisms are located in the landscape and how good is the trait value that they have with respect to the optimal trait value for that given environmental condition. So the width of these functions is given by a parameter that is basically standard deviation along that trait axis. And this standard deviation, it's something that we can manipulate, and it's I call it environmental fitness variability. The second evolutionary process that we have in the model is mutation, and this is an stochastic process. So every time that we have offspring, so this offspring, given a certain probability, they can either inherit the trait value of the parent, or they can just change the trait value, given by also another Gaussian distribution. And this Gaussian distribution will then be centered at the trait value of the parent, and the deviation is going to be given by this parameter, the mutation variability. Dispersal is also an stochastic process, as we implemented right now, and basically we take the location of the individual in the landscape, and then we just displace the individual by also dispersal variability in the two, the X and the Y dimension. So they randomly move in the environment. With respect to competition, as I mentioned, so they're competing for a single resource. So when you have a setting with no competition, so you will be counting for this carrying capacity, so the maximum number of organisms that a given environment can sustain, or local environment can sustain, we will count them all. But what we did was to have another Gaussian distribution. Instead of having a single, or to counting all the individuals, we're only counting the effective number of individuals. And the effectiveness of this is given by how similar the trait values are between the individuals. So in a local environment, then I just basically measuring pairwise distances of in terms of trait values between all of the individuals. And in terms of the trait values, they are very similar, they are very close to each other, so they are going to be counted. And if they are very far apart, they might not be competing for that resource. The competition is less strong. So, and like I mentioned, so this is the main extension that we did to the model was to extending to more than one trait value, and to have this, what I like to call this trait mediated competition. But the other processes are a standard process of adaptive speciation. The other addition that we do is, since we want to compare this to dated phylogenies, so this adaptive dynamics framework, generally what it produces is the evolution of traits over time. So, but in phylogenies, you have lineages through time. So groups of individuals. So what we did was to have a taxon definition, and we define taxon basically as a group of individuals sharing similar trait values and common ancestry. And we implemented a spectral clustering algorithm in the model that basically sort out the groups as the model is being executed. And how this works out, very simply put, so if you have at time 0, we have a group of individuals, but let's say we start with a population of a monomorphic group of organisms with very similar trait values. They will be grouped as a common ancestor. They are all the same taxon. And over time, if they diverge the trait values large enough, and with a given distance or a threshold value that we can manipulate, then this will be split into 2 groups. And then you have 2 lineages. And over time, if this splitting tends to accumulate, we can reconstruct phylogenies. So we keep track of the ancestor ID and of the taxon, the current taxon ID over time. So, but let's see how the model does. Yeah. So the best way to see it at the beginning is with the classical view of adaptive dynamics, and they normally show this by process of evolutionary branching on a linear environmental gradient. This is what I'm going to show you. I'm going to guide you through the figure because there's a lot of info on it. But on A to E, you see the model without competition. And on F to J, you have the model with competition, so trait-mediated competition. A and F show the number of organisms over time. So you see that it reaches a saturation point in state like that. So that's the carrying capacity that that you end up for this setting that I have. On B and G, you have the spatial distribution of these individuals at the last point of the simulation. And on the background, you see the color coding highlights the change in the environmental gradient. So it's linearly going from low to high elevation, etc. And on C and H, you see the trait distribution as a 2D histogram. On the so the darker the color means the higher the number of individuals with that particular trait value, and it's a trait value in this case associated with elevation, so the environmental field that we have. And you see less branching without competition and more branching with competition. And on D and I, you see the spatial distribution also as a 2D histogram for the last time step of the simulation, where you see that the spatial distribution along the x-axis of for the trait values of low trait values and high trait values, depending on where you are on the landscape. And on E and J, so the bottom, you see the reconstructed phylogenies that we can obtain after the algorithm that I just presented. So it resembles quite well the trait evolution over time. Okay. So, but how does it work in a more complicated landscape, or more complex landscape? So again, I have the example of the landscape that I showed you before, with the dynamic and static landscape. On the second set of panels, you see the changes in the number for each of the individuals. You're going to see several points coming up here on the trait related with rainfall, then with the trait related with elevation. And on the bottom, you see the number of taxon over time, the taxon richness over time. So what you can see is that the landscape evolves. You start with a monomorphic population of most of the species with high, or adapted to high rainfall patterns and low elevation. And for the static, I started the individuals also at a point that's similar. And what you can see is that the individuals, depending on whether the landscape is changing or not, they will try to adapt to be best fitted for the environmental conditions that they have had. So, and as this landscape is changing, so the trait distribution is going to change from one end to another. And the number of taxa over time is also going to change. But to compare the results, I think it's better to see it in this way. So where we have again, so the results on the left column without competition, the right column with competition. On the top row is for the static landscape, so the one that is not changing over time, and on the bottom is the dynamic landscape. The color coding, so the red marks basically for the extant taxa, so the taxa that is the end of the simulation, basically the ones that lives on the northern part of the landscape. And if you remember, so the northern part of the landscape that I'm modeling is the drier part. So, so this clear distinction between these two clades, so the wet and dry adapted clades. And the fascinating two main aspects that you can see here is that basically with competition has a promotion of biodiversity. So you have more lineages with competition than without competition. But between dynamic and static, you can see already that the time that it takes to build up these two distinct clades is just shifted. It's faster in a static landscape in this case, and it takes a bit longer for a dynamic landscape. So it's responding to the environment. Mm-hmm.
Can you just repeat what the north, so like rainier part does?
Let's see it here. So this is the y-axis.
Yeah.
So basically, I took the individuals that are at the end of the simulation, if they are located, their majority on the northern part of the landscape, so it will be the drier.
Okay.
Or if they are on the wetter part of the landscape.
Yeah. And so then in the next slide, what happens to them?
So here I just color code them to this extent taxa, where they are located in the landscape. So you can distinguish clades. For example, this has been, let's say, a dry adapted clade on the northern part of the landscape, and this has been a wetter adapted clade on the southern part of the landscape. Yeah. So it's a way just to visualize the spatial distribution of the organisms at the end. Yeah, sure. And but you can see it here. So I didn't explain it before. Sorry about that. So for each of these taxa, here I plotted these PDFs are basically the trait distribution for that taxon group. So here you see for elevation, basically to high elevation, or to low precipitation, high precipitation. So you can also see it from there, but I just add another visual aid for it here. Okay, so we suggest that there is a link between the rate of change in the environment and of course the eco-evolutionary process that we put in the model. So a way to test this is to basically just to change these parameters and to play around to see what we obtain. So I changed mainly the uplift rate. I changed the variability related to mutation and the variability related with dispersal. And here I run 10 simulations with different random seeds, because you have a stochastic process in this model. So it's so I have several simulations, and what you can see here is the number of lineages through time normalized. So when they reach the maximum, I will show you the absolute numbers of these lineages through time later on. But the color coding basically show you the black is the standard run, so the one that I showed you before, only like with repeated measurements, like a 10 measure. And I change in this case the uplift rate, so the top row, by 1 order of magnitude. So 3 millimeters per year, so very fast growing mountain, and 0.3 millimeters per year, a very slow growing mountain. And on the middle row, you see the dispersal rate that I did, again, 1 order of magnitude change, so 100 kilometers, and then just 1 kilometer of the baseline of 10. And the variability in terms of mutation also by 1 order of magnitude to the values. By the way, it's worth to mention that these parameter values, and we can talk about and discuss about this, they are not, I try to generate the model as general as possible, but they are not well constrained, and it cannot be well constrained for all groups of organisms in a planet. So that's why I'm varying them just to see what is the response of the model. So what you can see is that when the mountain grows faster, basically it reaches this plateau faster. And when the mountain is growing slower, it just takes longer to accumulate the number of species in that landscape. And when you have competition, basically you show more or less the same pattern. With dispersal and with mutation, basically you see that if they disperse like a lot across the landscape, so you see kind of like an initial peak, but then it decreases. But when they disperse very little, it just takes a bit of time, but then overcomes the other. You will see it better in the absolute numbers when I show you. And with respect of mutation, basically the faster that they can mutate, so the more species, the faster you accumulate the species in that landscape. And here I show you for the absolute numbers so that you can see at glance already. So with competition, you have higher number of, that's why I normalize, because it's easier to compare. But I show you that with competition, you have higher number of species, like I showed you before. And with respect to dispersal, which is easier seen here, is the slow dispersal rate. It just take a bit of time, but since they are moving slowly in the landscape, so they have enough time to adapt and to colonize these other areas. Whereas when they are moving along the landscape or crossing from one end to another, they need to have, or they will be better competitors to have like intermediate trait values not to be specialized. And this has been shown early on by Dickman, Dovelli, and by the others. So it's consistent with what we know what these models can do. And mutation is like I was saying, so the faster that the higher the mutation variability, the faster that you can accumulate taxa or species. And the opposite when you have very small mutation variabilities in this case. So I think we have a nice tool that is that we can play around. I think I'm okay with time now. So just coming to the end, it's like what we want to do with this tool, right? So the project that is financing me is basically focus their study site in the driest parts of the planet, so in the Atacama Desert and the Namib Desert. And it's called Earth Evolution at the Dry Limit. And here you see a beautiful picture of Tillandsia fields in the core of the Atacama Desert. So it's one of the very few plants that can live and tolerate these extreme and dry environments. And we are over here. Well, I was taking the picture, but we were over there, like a few 100 meters high. And my colleagues during the first and the second phase, the current second phase, have been doing a really good job at collecting information on timing this area, the northern and the southern part of the Atacama, and particularly they are focusing on trying to better measure the onset of hyperaridity. And this is the work that Benny has done in research. And but in addition, they have also atmospheric cluster that have been they're putting a lot of basically stations that are collecting rainfall data and higher resolution in the driest part. So we have like in situ really good data on precipitation and also some other variables. And also they have a biological cluster that they are basically dating organisms over there, like, and creating these beautiful dated phylogenies. And this is for a group of the Malvaceae family, so Cristaria, which is a plant that also lives in these environments, particularly related to the coastal cordillera. And they have associated the diversification points of this group of Cristaria to the uplift of the Andes and that region of the western cordillera, and then later on of the Altiplano and the eastern cordillera. So my work here, and this is still a work in process that I'm finalizing in the next months, but just to give you a taste of it, is that we are taking this information of present-day topography, present-day precipitation patterns, and we are trying to simulate and also paleo-elevation data, and try to reconstruct an Atacama-like scenario. So that includes also the Altiplano, so as a whole orogen. And here for this model, what I did was to have normally in the literature they describe the paleo elevation of different geomorphic provinces. So going from the coastal cordillera de Atacama, the western cordillera de Altiplano, then the eastern cordillera, and then the rest of that part of South America. And then as they describe this very discreetly in that way, depending on how you read the literature. But when we reconstructed using that, we can reproduce quite well. So the observation is the black line of the current elevation. And here you see the paleo elevations that we can get from using our model at different time steps. And with respect to precipitation, we also do an okay case, but it's still some parts are a bit off. And on the top row, you see also similarly as I showed before to a dynamic environment, one that is changing over time. And I also have a setting where I also have a static environment. So where I basically run it for 60 million years, but it's not changing just to as a type of control. And then, of course, I run on top of this the speciation model for a single run, and you see that there is a peak in elevation as this different mountain landscape is changing or associated with these jumps in the elevation at particular locations. But this is just one scenario of building a plateau reconstructed from observations. There have been other proposals, by one of those by my boss last year, and where they basically coupled FastScape, so the air surface process model that I'm using, to a geodynamic model. So basically mantle dynamics. And what you can see, what they observe, is that plateaus are formed, and this is for a subduction zone. Plateaus are formed once you have a type of end-member model that they call it with low erodibility, so that you can maintain this landscape for a very long time without being eroded. If you have this type of subduction zones with intermediate or high erodibility, you will end up just with a single mountain peak, perhaps high, like in the Southern Alps in New Zealand or in Taiwan, but you will unlikely end up generating a plateau. So what I'm going to test is whether these other more simplified ways of constructing a plateau, which will imply not to couple with this model because it's a bit more complicated. But this, as you can see, what it's doing is creating these faults and propagating the signal from this end to the other end. We can reproduce that basically as a sigmoidal uplift signal that propagates through the landscape. And we will also generate a plateau. So I'm going to test these type of end-member models of plateau forming and see how much we can describe the diversity patterns that we observe with the observations that my colleagues have collected for the Atacama Desert. And with this, so I hope I give you an impression. This is the hand of the desert, just at the entrance of the Atacama Desert, and I can give you a glimpse of the tool that we developed. It's still ongoing, the work. And clearly the mechanisms that we implemented, we observe how they influence the buildup of biodiversity, but there is still some limitations that we have. Some related to the simplicity of the process that we put, and the challenge of maintaining this computational efficiency that we currently have, because we can run this, I can run these models in my computer. It takes just a few minutes to run. It's very efficient, but as long as we change some of the settings, it becomes slightly more complicated, and then we will need a higher computational capacity for that. And at the moment, and this is something that I would like to get you guys the feedback on it, is like we have a lack of feedbacks on the live component to the other air system components that we have. And I will be keen to see how we can feedback live into these other components that we have in our model. And with that, thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you so much. That was fascinating coming from a non-this background. So we are going to go on to questions. We can start in the room, I think, and then go to the ones online.
Okay.
So for the people listening online, feel free to write your questions into the chat box now. But does anyone have a question straight off the bat?
Yes, please.
Yes, thank you so much for the talk. Really interesting. I was wondering, because I also work with coupling biology with geomorphology, and you always run into the problem of timescales, so the coupling. Evolution, of course, is very longer timescales as same as geology, so maybe you didn't run into a problem, but I was wondering if you can just couple those very frequently, or if you had to adjust some timescales. How did you have?
Yeah, that's a really good point. So this is So as you see, so the adaptive speciation models are run per generation, so that the time step that they have is per generation. So the way that we and this is how we put it also in the manuscript is at the time steps that we run the landscape evolution models. It's usually kilo years or certain number, 10, 20, whatever you want to do, and which means that each time step, each generation will have to accumulate all of that range of variability for that period of time. So these sigmas values that I have in the eco-evolutionary model need to account for that amount of variability for the given time step of the landscape evolution model. But the parameters of these models, of the eco-evolutionary models, are not really that well constrained. So, for example, the approach that I want to follow for this case is actually to we know more or less the ranges that we can take for the environmental selection, for mutation variability, and for dispersal variability. And what I can do is to have a random selection of this, which will be like the history of a particular clade or group of organisms, and run thousands of this with a random selection of different of these ecological parameters, so eco-evolutionary parameters. And then compare these lineages through time with the observations that we have. And we see how many of those we still have a signal that is related with the uplift settings that we have. Or if I manipulate the timing of the rainfall patterns with the timing of the rainfall pattern. So it's kind of like the idea that I want to follow, given the level of uncertainty that we have, particularly with the eco-evolutionary.
So just to, I don't know, but are they dependent on elevation precipitation only? Is that kind of the main?
Yep, this is how I determine right now.
Yeah.
But I build up the framework flexibly in the sense that if one wants to do a model that only responds to an elevation gradient, you can also run with one. Or if you want to have two traits responding to elevation, to have a type of trade-off with respect to elevation, that is also possible, or four traits. So it's flexible. That's why I build it up in that way, so that it could be manipulated very easily depending on who wants to do that. And eventually, if you have another environmental field, it could also be extended to that other environmental field as well. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, sure.
Do we have another question for in the room?
I've got a question that I don't know if it's a good question.
No, there are always, yeah.
So does it also account for the unexpected changes, you know, the physical changes, like say like this, and is a technique of model the way?
Like you mean like a landslide or like a debris for like natural disaster? Yes, yes. So the landscape evolution models can also be used for debris flows, and lots of my colleagues basically dedicate just to develop pathscapes. So the framework that we are using just to model landslides. But in terms of the buildup of biodiversity, this will be at a shorter time scales. The effect that they will have perhaps a landslide to clearing a part of the mountain, and then it will be the rebuild up of that biota into that part, or maybe a lava flow or something like that. So it will be a shorter time scale, but the physical processes will be very similar to what we have, with some details related with the composition of the sediments that you have, because that depends whether you have landslide or debris flow or any other process, and the amount of water that you have in the soil, how much you have accumulated. So there are other intricacies that you have in that you might need to take into account. So it will not be as simple as I put it, just with that hillslope process. It will be a bit more complicated. But in principle, yes. Yeah.
I think Tim had a question.
Yep.
Yeah, we can have a chat later about this coupling between the biology and the landscape. My instincts would be that's more really important in wetter settings with trees, deeper rooting, soils, they can stabilize and reduce erosion and increase erosion.
Yep.
Depends on the setting. But for your dry settings,
Mhm.
quite a lot of localized niche construction going on by biology, especially plants, and
Mhm.
in the sense of like clever trait strategies to kind of capture what little moisture there is available and keep hold of it.
Yep.
I mean, and how do you, I guess it's an extra computational challenge to even think about that.
Mhm.
But how important are those kind of localized feedbacks and potentially to exploring some of the diversity you see, like in these very arid
Yep.
mountain environments? Because
Yep. They are very important. So this, yes. So yeah. So how important is the feedback of the processes of the biota, particularly in dry environments, to generate a biodiversity or to have the buildup of biodiversity settings. And the best way that I could think of to explain it is with these guys.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
this is Tillandsias. So it's a group of plants. It's a few species, but they can be distributed across southern Peru or the middle of Peru, all the way. So from the hyper-arid core to the arid areas of South America, and we have them in Namibia, in South Africa, or Southern Africa, sorry. And the cool thing about these plants is that they, as they grow, they settle and they grow on top of each other. So these dunes that you see and these stripes basically is these guys basically shaping the landscape. And yeah, and it's fascinating to see. And the only thing that they depend on is on the fog that comes from the coast, and they capture it and they grow to the direction that they are receiving this moisture. So it's so these are a group of organisms, but also we saw, or I saw, but my colleagues are also measuring these bacteria and lichens, so microorganisms, and you have soil crust that is being built up, and this also could probably have an effect. But most of this desert is gypsum desert, so it's you have a lot of a material that is not. Yeah, it's not that kind with life in that respect, particularly with plants. So you need really tough guys to grow up in those type of soils. But the advantage is that maybe you guys have seen it. Once it rains, just the desert blooms basically. So there is also a seed bank, and this is one of the aspects that I was mentioning towards the end of the simplicity of the ecological process that we have. I don't have a type of dormancy or something like that could be very relevant for dry environments. In the case that once you have a suitable set of conditions, basically life taking over these very inhospitable places. So these are aspects that I will, if I continue developing the model, I would like to include and to test them out to see how they impact biodiversity.
We've got time for one more question, if anyone in the room still has some more. Okay, well, I think that's, yeah, there no more questions in the chat. So in that case, thank you again. If people want to continue the discussion, we have refreshments upstairs in room 825. If you don't know where that is, you can just follow us. And we also have another event in half an hour, just over half an hour, Climate Cafe, where you can talk about how this seminar, for example, made you feel amongst other climate change topics. Thank you again for coming.
Thank you, guys.